name is Amy Solomon. Thank you. I'm Vice President of Criminal Justice at the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. So I'm going to start with Jake. We got a preview this morning of the new brief that came out. For those who missed it this morning and to go a little deeper, can you share some of that information and what Pew is planning to do with this work?
Absolutely. And if whoever's running the slides, if you could cue up figure 1 as I get going. Just to, for those who weren't there this morning, Pew and Arnold launched publicly an initiative where we're going to partner to help reform probation and parole. We're going to try to shift the value set from punishing failure to promoting success. And we are kicking this off with a public report that tries to draw attention to some of the biggest problems facing the system. Basically, we think it's a system that's flown under the radar for too long, and really it should be a top priority for policymakers and those members of the public who care about public safety and care about the functioning of the justice system. When we fail to act on the system, we suffer too much crime, we suffer too much drug misuse, and we suffer too much incarceration. On the flip side, when states do take the reins of this system, we can reduce both recidivism and levels of incarceration and recidivism. And so we're going to draw some attention to some of those lessons and successes at the state level. So this first chart is about the scale of community supervision control at the state level. So the big numbers we're drawing away from here is that 1 in 55 adults in this country is under probation or parole supervision. We're talking about 4.5 million people. We're talking about growth of 239% since 1980. What's remarkable to me, to pull out some additional points that we didn't talk about this morning, is you see that peaked in 2007. There's actually been, a meaningful decline. We're talking about 11% decline. It was 1 in 45 back in 2007. That represents 581,900 fewer people under supervision. That's a lot of people. But you see, that barely makes a dent in that curve up on the screen. And so when you're talking about 581,900 fewer people and it barely makes a dent, you know you're talking about a really big system. If you can flip to figure 2. This one we didn't put up on the screen, and for fear that it's kind of tough to explain sometimes in quick summary. But when we kicked off the idea of this chart book, one of the things we wanted to get at was how much of this growth was driven by sort of natural stuff, right? More people in the United States, or more crime, or something like that. And for those of you, actually Carol Mason this morning talked about the National Academy's study that President Travis actually led. And for those of you who really nerd out on that stuff, you might remember this amazing chart in there that talked about how almost all the growth in the 80s wasn't due to crime. It was due to more admissions per arrest to prison. And almost all the growth in the prison population in the 90s wasn't due to crime. It was due to longer lengths of stay per admission to prison. So naturally, we turned to the 2 authors of that study, Al Bloomstein and Alan Beck. Wonderful guys. We sent them an email one day at like 4 p.m. And by 4:30, we got an email back from Al Bloomstein, this sort of, the grandfather of American criminology. I couldn't believe my inbox, right? And he's like, let's get on the phone and talk about this. So we get on the phone, and we were really disappointed to find out the data simply would not support that, right? So one problem is that we just simply can't answer some of these questions. So this is the second best. That's my big setup for this is the second best. And what we found here was that probation and parole per unit crime or per unit arrest has grown. So the takeaway from this is that the growth in probation and parole was not because of more people or just for more crime. It's that we've actually become more punitive. We've put more people under supervision. And this echoes the same findings we have in incarceration over the last 20, 30, 40 years, basically the past generation. But there's a whole lot more research and digging we need to do here. Tell me if I need to speed up. Can you put up figure 4? So we talked this morning about the variation, who's impacted. And so, right, we can't just talk about costs and benefits. We have to talk about how they're distributed, who's impacted by the system of community supervision in the country. So we talked about, yeah, there's big differences between men and women, but there's huge growth in the number of women under supervision. More than 1 million women currently under supervision in this country. It's doubled since 1990. If those women were a city, they'd be in the top 10 biggest cities in this country. It's a pretty amazing thing to think about. We talked about the racial differences. Black adults 3.5 times as likely as white adults to be under supervision. 13% of the population, 30% of people under correctional control in this country. We talked about for misdemeanors, 4 in 10, more than 4 in 10 are under, more than 4 in 10 probationers under supervision for a misdemeanor. And the data reporting is so poor here, we know it's higher than that, we just don't know how high. Again, great place for more research to be done. One thing missing from here, you'll know, is Hispanics. Why are they not here? Because states don't report it. Huge gap. We need to learn more about that. Could you throw up figure 5? This just basically points out that more than 3/4 of people under supervision in this country are supervised for a nonviolent conviction. Not sure I want to pull much more of that one, but pretty fascinating data point. And then throw up figure 6. Sorry, I'm asking a lot, I know, of our AV guy here. Another chart, I think figure 6. Thank you. So a lot you can pull out of this slide. One is that roughly half, a little more than half of people exit supervision successfully. Let's not lose track of that, okay? Basically, most people do just fine. That's a lot of people we're talking about. There's another lesson from here, which is there are a lot of unknowns. The data tracking at the federal level is actually, that's a problem. If 1 out of 5, we just don't know what happens, how can that be the case? We need to figure something out about that. And then the last lesson from this is that if you look at those orange slices, those orange slices are people whose exit from probation and parole is an admission to a jail or prison. That's 350,000 individuals every year. If you can throw up the next slide, this is the last one I'll describe. This is that same slice seen from the other perspective, which is admissions to prison in this country. So in many states, 50, 60, and up to 70% of prison admissions are revocations from probation and parole. And the takeaway from this for our report was that the system that's meant to be a primary alternative to incarceration in this country is in fact a feeder system. And if you've worked in any of these states, Arkansas being the state that's at the bottom of that list there, this is from a Council of State Government's Justice Center report, you'll well know that if you want to go in and do an analysis of what's driving prison population growth, and I see some faces around this room who have done these analyses, you know one of the first questions you ask is, let's talk about revocation from probation and parole. You see a state like Arkansas there, 54% coming in off parole. The people who know the story of Arkansas know very well what that all traces back to. These are not tough stories to tell, and so I think there's plenty of data to help illuminate why it's such an important system for understanding if you care about public safety in this country, if you care about what's driving incarceration, if you care about the functioning of the justice system. Turn it back to you.
Thank you. I want to turn to Commissioner Bermudez and hear how these data ring to you and to your ears, and if you could talk a little bit about what probation looks like, traditional probation, business as usual, and then what you're doing in New York City.
Can you hear me? Okay. So, in a way, thankfully, what is happening in the rest of the country is not happening here in New York City. In the sense that the majority of the people who are on probation in New York City are on probation for a felony conviction, and a lot of the people who are on probation for misdemeanor convictions the case started as a felony, a significant number of them, and then they're on probation on the plea, on the misdemeanor. So what we've seen in New York City is a reduction in arrests, a reduction in then folks coming into probation. In part it's because the system, there's been reforms around the entire system. It's not just one entity. It's not just like that NYPD is arresting fewer people and then, then probation is accepting fewer people. There's also DA's offices and other charging processes, sentencing reform that has really allowed people who should not be under supervision not to be under supervision. Okay, that's really important to have that, because I think we went through a period of time, I think that's reflected in the numbers, where the view was the more supervision, the better. The more eyes on people, the better. Current research, and this is an evolution of the department that we've seen, and a lot of departments around the country, the work that we did with Robina demonstrates that, and other initiatives we've had, is that we really have to calibrate what we do with some levels of risk that we can assess, and that's another whole panel on risk assessment. But let's just take it at face value that people who present low-risk behaviors don't need to be under supervision for as long, nor do they need to be under the type of supervision that others have been in. So we've evolved from a compliance-based, the more supervision, the better, the sort of one-size-fits-all approach to probation to a research-informed, one-size-fits-one, and community-focused process of probation. So here in the city, we've calibrated all of our caseloads. We've also started specialized caseloads for adolescents and young adults because even though they represent, for example, a third of our people on probation, they account for almost half of all rearrest behavior that we see. So, and there's all sorts of brain science now helping us. There's all sorts of other things that really create opportunities for young people. So we've turned probation into what we would like to call a stage of opportunity in the system and a stage of growth, rather than just a compliance-based, you must just avoid rearrest as the goal here, right? And so we've invested a lot of time in training our staff, in developing better case planning processes so that we really can develop that one-size-fits-one.
And just a quick follow-up here. You talked about reducing size. One thing that often comes as the second part of that sentence is reducing costs. But one thing I think I've heard is that your department has actually increased the cost per probationer for the people you've kept in the system. Is that right?
That's how it's ended up being, but that wasn't necessarily the goal in the sense of, yes, I suppose with fewer people on probation and increased resources for people on probation, that the expenditures per person have increased. That's right. That doesn't mean that that our budget has ballooned either, though. We have been able to do it within the regular growth. We have, however, I do have to say, when I started in 2010 as Deputy Commissioner for Juvenile, and from then to now, probation went from having, 13 contracts with CBOs to now we have almost 65. So we've invested also a lot in creating opportunities in the community with community members in the areas where people live. So I think that it's kind of a complex budgetary situation, actually.
I presume they're also the higher risk, higher
Yes,
need
they're
people.
high, absolutely.
Great, thank you. So Deanna, your organization aims to cut correctional population in half by 2030. What does probation and parole have to do with that mission?
So one of the things that I always like to start with is the saying that our founder says that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. But when you look at, if our goal is to cut correction population in half by 2030, we must understand what is the driver of incarceration. So when we look at mass supervision, we know it's the underlying of mass incarceration, which some states, as you can see, Arkansas has that high percentage. So through some of the initiatives and campaigns we currently have going on, like we have a closed MSDF, which is a facility in Milwaukee that's focused on closing a secure detention facility that specifically was built for probation and parole. Currently, 65% of a certain population, there's a documentary out around 53206, I think, Milwaukee, where 65% of those individuals in that zip code are housed or have visited that facility. So the facility, and we know communities of black and brown color are over-policed, individuals are being violated for what's called crimeless revocations. So we are actually criminalizing quality of life issues. So for Just Leadership to take a look at that, that is a strategic initiative we can look at to get us close to half by 2030 as we can.
And Dr. Rulin, you have been studying this in your previous life, I know that you looked at a lot of counties and probation revocations and violations in particular, and interviewed both probation officers and probationers, and would love to hear some of your insights from that study.
Yeah, thanks. So my focus is really on probation and parole and understanding what leads to violations and revocations. And so a lot of times we hear, probation, that's a good thing. It's an alternative to incarceration. We're not locking people up. But what I have seen through my research and through the research of others is that probation can be just as, and sometimes more difficult than prison. When we look at probation conditions, so the things that individuals must do to successfully complete their probation, that can range from, in some states, up to 25, 30 conditions. And these are just general conditions that apply to all people on probation. So some of the conditions are, you must abstain from places that serve alcohol. Well, a little audience participation, where would that be? Where? Everywhere, pretty much, right? Like baseball games, restaurants. Somebody told me Chuck E. Cheese now serves alcohol. So like tons of places where people cannot go where they serve alcohol. Grocery stores. In some states, and I think this is Wisconsin, so I had a research assistant at the University of Cincinnati who were working on a study where we're looking at probation conditions, general probation conditions, in all 50 states. One of the states is you cannot get a loan, a car loan, without checking with your probation officer. I think that's Wisconsin. Another one is you can't go to a casino. You have to pay child support. So like all these conditions, just random conditions. You can't hang out with people who have criminal records. So if you're family or friends, again, general conditions. So we're saying that if individuals do not meet these conditions, that they can be violated and ultimately revoked to prison or jail. Now the story is a little bit more complex when I do meet with probation officers and do some work in probation agencies. Oftentimes we talk about people getting revoked for technical violations, and those are those things that are non-criminal, so like missed appointments, showing up late, dirty drug tests. Now people are getting revoked for technical violations, but it's often not the case that people are getting revoked right away. So it's not that they have one technical violation and they're getting revoked. It's often multiple technical violations where the probation officer is sanctioning individuals, and then the sanctions aren't working, or they're just out of options. So I think that my research really looks at the complexities of probation, because sometimes, for probation officers, they feel like their hands are tied. We saw this a lot in the work that I've done across the country, is that they just don't have any other options after providing sanction after sanction after sanction. So, I think we do need to put less people on probation overall. And we need to look at other intermediate sanctions. So in the criminal justice system, we have a whole bunch of things that we can do: community service, ankle bracelets without supervision. So there's a whole bunch of other options that we have. But for some reason, probation with all these conditions are our go-to, which then just ends up delaying people's entry into prison, unfortunately. And then people often have to pay for the privilege of supervision, and that can be quite costly. In one of the sites I work with, the probation fee is $60 a month. So if you're sentenced to 5 years probation, that's $60 a month that you are paying for that probation. And that only includes the supervision fee. And so they also have to pay for drug testing, if they're ordered to any anger management or life skills classes. They have to pay their court fees, oftentimes attorney fees. And these are ordered as a condition of probation. So if you're not paying these, you can be revoked. And the Supreme Court ruled in 1983 that you can't be revoked for failure to pay if you don't have the means to pay. But that means to pay is actually a lot of times determined, if you have, one judge said, if you come into my courtroom and you have nice headphones, that shows me that you have the ability to pay. You just have misplaced priorities. So a lot of times, and I heard it all the time from probation officers doing home visits. If they have a big flat screen TV, then I think they have the means to pay. They can pawn their TV, or they can ask their family or friends for the money. And for them, that was a viable solution because, as one probation officer said, a direct quote, that what happens if you don't pay your car note? you get repoed. Well, same thing, we're gonna repo you. So for them, it was very much a priority because this was a condition of their supervision. So looking at all the complexities and the difficulties of successfully completing probation, I guarantee if most of us were on probation, we would not successfully complete it.
Just on this very last note, when I was outside a few minutes ago prepping for this session, someone came up to me who had been at the morning conference and said that she was a former police officer and her son was on probation, a 30-year-old in Georgia, and so the Georgia number stood out to her, only had traffic violations, seat belts, music, piled up, and has 7 years on probation. And the fines and fees, the fees associated are so high. He's working, he's trying to be stable with his family, but she is stepping in to pay those. And when they've gone to the judge to try and make alterations, that they've added on more time and more fees and said just a desperation, what could he do? It's everywhere, and I know we'll hear about this a little bit more from you in a moment.
And can I just add that probation lengths too, that's another thing that we don't talk about, is that we think, probation a couple of years, but in some states, Minnesota being one, I know there's other states, I think Washington, you can be on probation for lifetime. Some states you can be on probation for 25, 30 years. So these are long sentences, and under these general conditions, again, that I mentioned, that it's very hard, again, to complete when you have long sentences like that.
Let me just ask one more question on the interviews you were doing with the probation offices. Did you hear many POs talking about ways they were using incentives to help with compliance on conditions?
Yeah, so that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction on the use of incentives. I think New York actually used incentives quite a bit, so you're probably the best to talk about that. But so if people are, doing what they're supposed to be doing on probation and complying with the conditions, sometimes probation officers will use incentives, either gift cards or sometimes they'll request early discharge. That's a little bit harder, and the policies vary state by state. But yeah, we did hear incentives quite a bit, but I don't know if you wanted to say more.
Yeah, we're using a range of incentives because, as I said, we were moving to the one-size-fits-one, sort of research-informed, and procedural justice. The work of procedural justice is really important because sometimes the best incentive is to recognize when people are doing things right, and noting that, and then talking about how that can impact what's happening on probation, and therefore. We also have it built in that we can give merit credit, what's called merit credit, to people on probation, so that if they're doing well, you can reduce the amount of time they come see you. As was noted, sometimes we have gift cards and whatever. We also have a contract with an organization called Benevolent, where it's kind of like a crowdfunding. Is that what it's called? Crowdsourcing, whatever it's called. That the young people on probation, particularly, but also older folks on probation, can, with their probation officers, sort of make a pitch, if you will, for something they need. We've gotten laptops. We've gotten textbooks for college. We have had people who need. Either a set of bedding for furniture for homes, things like that. That we can also do that when people are in need. So that's.
The research says that you should use incentives 4 times more often than sanctions, but it's really hard for a lot of probation officers to think about and use. Even in a small way, to incentivize behavior. Deanna, so you have a unique perspective here. As a formerly impacted person in the system and leading a cadre of people who have been formerly impacted. So can you talk to us about what people who've been through the system have to put on the table here in terms of reforms they'd like to see?
Thanks. I wanted to follow up to something the doctor said about research of why it's important to always have directly impacted people at the table when you're collecting data. Because, of course, interviewing with officers, they'll project what they should be doing instead of what the person, or the end user or receiver, is actually experiencing with the system. And I always like to use my story that being sentenced to probation initially, suffering from a drug addiction, first dirty urine screen, immediately sent to jail without going past go. Never offered treatment, other kind of services directly to jail. But if you look at our system, when you research our system in Ohio, they say they have these sanctions of process that they put in place, but not everybody is available. But one of the things that we had been talking at Just Leadership with the team is, when we look at probation and we say probation is not a privilege, it is your sentence, it's not probation is your sentence, it's probation inclusive of jail, not an alternative to jail. Because if I don't do right on probation, I still end up going to jail. And I come from a community where I've seen a lot of individuals choose 1 year in jail versus 5 years probation, because the revolving cycle of how our communities are over-policed and how we look at things. So one of the things that we are really looking at is, how do we actually utilize probation for those who need probation? And I always like to say, when I study criminal justice at UC, one of the things when probation was created as a case management tool for people to be successful once released. Somewhere down the road, we gave them a gun and the whole process changed. It became law enforcement and this actual punitive incentive instead of looking at it as case management tool to assist people. So I applaud probation departments that are looking at probation officers being more of an assistance instead of a punitive nature. But from our perspective of individuals directly impacted, how do we reduce the footprint of probation and parole? How do we actually, if probation is the sentence, let probation be the sentence, and if there's a violation of rules that is based on quality of life, allow the community services to address those issues if it's substance abuse, mental health, not making appointments. We have truly penalized those quality of life issues and individuals' inability. Sometimes we take for granted that an individual has the ability to pay a fine because they have a flat screen TV at home where you made. It might have been a birthday gift. But just those things of how society still looks at individuals with records or individuals in the system, and still, I always say you can't reform implicit bias. So the process has to state what it is, and we have to hold individuals accountable in the systems.
Commissioner Bermudez, I have another question. Just building on this point, your credible messenger program, does this speak to?
Yes, I mean, we are also we follow the challenge. I mean, the challenge in the good way of making us do it, of having the people closest to the problem be, we believe they're closest to the solution. When I started, and Clinton Lacey was the Deputy Commissioner for Adult Operations, we embarked on a very big initiative to bring credible messenger mentors into the work of probation, people in the community who've been through the system, who want to give back, who have had that insight and that commitment to really, especially getting young people to not to remain in the system or to never enter the system. So we went to the community, we asked for input as to what's needed for our young people, for the young adults who are on probation, the young adults who are incarcerated. And we came up with this program that we procured, and we now have 19 Arches programs around the city that have been evaluated by the Urban Institute, I have to say this, that demonstrated 69% reduction in reconviction rates for felonies among the 16 to 24-year-olds, and that's unprecedented in the first year, and it held the second year to 57% reduction in reconvictions. So this has, and then what happened was, this was intended for the young people. Well, guess what? Relationships being what they are, this is supposed to be a transformational process. It's transformed the probation officers, the participants in the programs, the mentors themselves, because we've also then invested in the Credible Messenger Justice Center to make sure that then the mentors also have increased opportunities for mobility and both job readiness and education advancement, et cetera. So this has grown into very connected to communities, because we also have community-based offices in the 7 neighborhoods that were with the highest concentration of people on probation. And so a lot of the work that gets done in those community offices are also available to the community and to people on probation. So we're really trying to, put honestly the community back into community corrections and really be, integrated into the fabric of the communities where our people on probation live.
Do you know of other jurisdictions that are trying to replicate this program?
Yes, Clinton went to DC, so he immediately did it in DC. So he's now the head of the DC, DYRS, and so that's happening there. We've had San Diego come in and, go through we have a little immersion program, for folks who are interested in doing this. So San Diego, Connecticut, LA, there's been Chicago, other places, Orange County here in New York, have been interested in replicating. So, yeah.
I'm going to turn back to you to talk about fines and fees. We know that this is an issue. We've already talked about several examples, but it's really hard to get your hands around the issue. We know there's a lot of variation. You are launching some work in this space. Can you talk about it?
Yes. So thanks to the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, I have gotten some funding to do a multi-state study looking at fines and fees in community corrections. And so we're going to be looking specifically in probation and parole and looking at what are the state policies, because in each state it varies so much about what's the amount that they assess, how much do they assess, what happens, are they revoked, violated. In many cases, individuals' probation and parole terms are extended because to allow more time to pay. In some states, that then tacks on the additional supervision fee. So you just, you've extended the period, but you've also extended what's due. Some states don't do that. Again, so just really trying to understand the complexities of this issue and to really understand all the different fines and fees that people have to pay in community corrections. And what makes it different than other studies that look at fines and fees in the criminal justice system is that these individuals are on community supervision. So again, as I mentioned earlier, if they're not paying these fines and fees and it's determined that they have the ability to pay, then they can be revoked more easily than, if it's like if we're just dealing with parking tickets or traffic stops. These people are under the thumb, already hanging over their head of incarceration. So it's much easier for these individuals to be revoked. And this is a huge moneymaker. In one of the jurisdictions that I work with, they made $1.7 million just on supervision fees. So that's not the other fees. That's just the $60 a month that they made one county. And they depend on it. It funds 2/3 of their budget, so it funds probation officers. And so probation officers know that if they don't make this, that they're gonna potentially have to face cuts. They might not get raises. One of the directors said that he's canceling the holiday party because of low collection rates. So again, it's a conflict of interest when you know that your salary is dependent on collecting the supervision fees. And it definitely, to your point, takes it away from this rehabilitative framework. It even takes it away from a law enforcement framework. It becomes purely revenue generation. So we're going to look at this issue more deeply, and we're going to look at it in 7 states. I always forget one state, but let's see if I can do this. Massachusetts, Indiana, Texas, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, and Arizona. So those are the states that will be doing this study in probation and parole.
It's going to be a groundbreaking study, and we're so excited about it. And I want to do a brief advertisement. In the next session, there's a panel that focuses solely on fees and fines. My colleague Julie James is going to be moderating that. And it's going to get at a lot of issues, including the fact that many departments are counting on these dollars for their budgets and how to think about solving for that. Jake, I want to turn it back to you to talk about some of the reforms that are already underway in states around the country.
Sure, and while I get started, you can throw, it's already up, thank you. So One of the things we were worried about when we started getting this report going was that we were going to paint this picture that just sort of made people think, oh my gosh, this is so bad, we can't do anything about it, and throw up our hands, and why even work on it if we're just sort of pushing against this boulder that keeps rolling down the hill. And so the first slide I put up showed how there's been some progress, right? 11% reduction since the high water mark of 2007. This is another way of cutting it. So looking, breaking out the 50 states and looking at where there's been some progress. And since that high water mark of 2007, 37 states reduced both their community supervision and crime rates simultaneously. And as I mentioned this morning too, some of those states like South Carolina and Texas reduced both rates by 20% or more. So that's actually a pretty substantial movement. People think these are sort of these immovable systems. They're gigantic and there's never going to budge. But as the commissioners mentioned, with New York City's probation numbers down how much in the last 10, 15 years? A lot. You heard it here first. Right. I mean that's gigantic, right? In some sense, if think about it in terms of other fields we care about. If cancer rates drop by half, these are really big movements, and I think let's not throw up our hands about this stuff. If you could kick it to the next slide, part of what we're talking about here too is what moved it. So actually, Brian Elgren right down here worked in Missouri back in 2012. One of the policies they moved was an earned compliance credit, basically like good time for people in prison, right? You play by the rules, you get off supervision faster. That's a good incentive. It also allows supervision officers to focus their resources on the people who have a harder time, who need the treatment resources, things like that. And you can see there's that inflection point at 73,000 people under supervision. So we're already talking about a really large supervision population in Missouri, right? And then in the post-reform period, the supervision population falls 18%. Keep in mind, people couldn't even earn these earned compliance credits till they'd been on supervision for 2 years. People in that state were averaging 4 years under supervision, so these are pretty long terms, as we discussed earlier. And we actually did a propensity score match evaluation, KZAF. You got to recognize the researchers who toil in the field to get this done. At the University of Maryland now did the study. No change in recidivism. It's a good outcome. Someone else mentioned earlier about technical violations. So let's call it some other states. South Carolina put in place some of these administrative sanctions, something short of revocation to cut down on that recycling we see, the revocations that drive people back into the system. And they saw a 46% reduction in these technical revocations into the system between fiscal 10 and fiscal 15. South Carolina is one of these states. Now everything's going perfectly there, of course, but really big reduction in the imprisonment rate in South Carolina during that period of time. And so here you see how things we do under supervision can reduce, they haven't cut 50, but there's a number between 0 and 50, and they're moving along that number.
And Commissioner, do you want to speak a little bit about how you've reduced revocations in New York City?
So this has been going on for a while. There's been an effort of the agency to really cut down on technical violations on probation. As was mentioned before, if somebody is having a substance abuse problem, let's pick marijuana to pick the most popular drug of choice, and they get rearrested for marijuana, what's a revocation or a violation of probation going to do? We keep trying to do the treatment, to do the work. When it's a public safety concern, what we're trying to do is just a public safety concern lens before you file a violation. Then there's other violations you have to file because our state regulations say we can't find the person, it's technically an absconder, that's not a technical violation, that's an absconding violation, so then we file those. So if you keep those aside, we've reduced our filing rate for technical violations is below 5% for in adult, and in juvenile is less than 2%. So we're really trying to just look for different ways of addressing the behavior and the issues that give rise to a technical violation. And then with the violations for new arrests, we don't file right on arrest. If it's a violation for a felony, we expect a certain amount of due process to happen before we file the violation. In New York, based on the Arches evaluation, in that evaluation, about a third of all arrests went nowhere. right? So that's why we're very happy to be able to do a reconviction measure rather than a rearrest measure. And so we know since that happens sometimes, so once the case gets indicted, then there's a filing of the violation. So we've done a lot of work and also trying to use restorative practices as part of as the vehicle by which we do administrative reviews when something starts going wrong, and then involve the community as well as much as possible to be able to avoid revocation. Oh, and then the other thing is once we file, we don't always ask for revocation. I mean, for incarceration. There is oftentimes a resentencing. We're working on trying to also look at different ways that we can enhance the conditions of probation that is not from a punishment perspective, but for if we need a service component of it, that will do that, and that's helped quite a bit.
Thank you. So we are going to open this up for questions. I think do we have a mic, or we'll pass one of these mics back, and if people can just identify themselves and their organizations and then ask the question, we will tee up a number of questions and then come back to the panel for some closing thoughts.
Mark Levin, great panel. Just a quick question, maybe I missed this, but who are the mentors that are being used, and are they being compensated, or just interested in how we can replicate it? Thank you.
So we contract with community-based organizations, and part of the contracting process, it is required for them to hire at least half of the mentors have to be credible messenger mentors, people who have criminal justice backgrounds. And so the agency, advertises in the community. They're usually from the communities that they're serving. They are compensated. That was also very important. Some have and there's a combination. Some of them are full-time. Some of them are part-time. Some can work with more than one agency, and so we've tried to make sure that it's not. That we knew that the quote-unquote traditional mentor of the mentor volunteer that spends time, with someone, let's say going to the movies or whatever, was not the model we needed or wanted, and so they have a curriculum. It starts as every session has to start with a meal. They eat together first, then they do their curriculum, which is a cognitive-based, set of exercises and other. It's broader than that by this point because everybody has brought their flavor in. I'm looking at Liz with the anti-violence programming and any number of other programs or initiatives. And then the night ends. It's twice a week. The night ends with a checkout, for reflection, and it's 5 mentors to 20 young people.
Tony Irving, Get in Chicago. I'm wondering if you talked a lot about incentives and making more use of them, and I'm wondering if you can share any research that you've used as a basis for your incentive strategy or any outcome data that you might have about the usage of it.
I'll just say the research on incentives is actually pretty limited on whether or not it actually works or not. What we do know is that sanctions don't work, so punishment doesn't work. But on the flip side, the sanctions, again, is limited. Maybe what's shown to be effective is early discharge, using that as an incentive. But again, there's some risk in that because with departments that depend on supervision fees, they're less, they might be less likely to early discharge people. And then again, this whole issue of compliance and non-compliance and really supervising people for social welfare issues is also a potential concern. But I will say the research, I guess, to sum it up, is pretty limited on the effectiveness of incentives.
Leslie Kornfeld, formerly with the Mayor's Office and the Obama administration. This has been a great panel. I'm wondering if you could talk about incentives, not for the supervised, but for parole supervisor, parole and probation supervisors themselves. So are there any bright spots where we have taken that vast resource and tried to engage them as part of the solution, either in terms of incentives or trainings, mentorships or otherwise? I know it's such a vast resource that I know many have wondered if there are opportunities to leverage them in new and different ways.
Well, let me see. So you're talking about incentives for the probation officers themselves to do what they need to do?
To get better outcomes.
To get better outcomes.
To get better outcomes for, those that they're...
Well, we don't, unfortunately in government, we don't have the incentives that people have in the private sector of raises and other, but we do try to, for example, we have an option in performance evaluations to have a commendation from the commissioner, let's say, for work particularly well done or something. We're trying to use that more. We have quarterly performance roundtables where people's data is, shared with the senior leadership, and they have to sort of account for their trends and whatnot, and therefore you get a lot of props when your trends are going the right way. You get shout outs in different ways. We don't have when people think of incentives, people think of things given, right? But as was said before, sometimes the early discharge, the recognition from others, the part of our case planning process is built on this, where there's like week to week or meeting to meeting action steps that are supposed to be created that, in a way that they breed checkoffs, like how that's an incentive. Oh, I did that. I can check that off. I accomplished that. And so that's driving a lot of the work that we're doing for the supervision of folks on probation to be able to do that. So that's, I think, a field that we need to explore more in terms of how do we incentivize government employees.
So we've thought a lot about this. So one of the big questions is, if this system is so big, why does it get so little attention? And we think one of the reasons is because it appears to be so cheap, right? If a prison bed costs $25,000 a year, but probation costs a couple grand, maybe it just doesn't rise to the level that people want to pay attention to. But that's actually that's only because you're looking at the apparent costs, right? If half of prison admissions are people coming off of revocation, what that reveals is that nobody can spend money like a probation or parole officer. If you can revoke somebody for a set of dirty or positive drug tests or skipping curfew or things like that, you actually have an amazingly prolific wallet. And so, and this, when we work in the States, you see this stuff all the time. Right? This is actually what we've been doing for the past decade, is trying to figure out this really poor alignment between local and state fiscal incentives, shall we say, okay? So part of what a bunch of states have started, and this actually started on the juvenile side of things, where states would make fiscal promises to counties. Because this, okay, here's the way this plays out. A judge will say, I don't want to send this kid away to the state facility, but I have no options locally. So it's either I slap their hand or I send them away to the state correctional facility where they're going to get some services. So you tell me what to do. And so what the state says, how about this as an alternative situation? For every kid below last year's baseline, last year you sent me 100 kids, how about next year you send me 50 and we'll cut you a check for half the difference in savings to the state? Because it costs us $100,000 a year when you send us a kid, so we'll cut you a check for $50,000 per kid less than you sent us last year. And the local judges love that, because with $50,000 per kid, can you believe what they can buy for services for that kid? So how about that for let's talk about that as a incentive for probation and parole. What could we buy locally with those kinds of dollars?
California's tried that, Arizona's tried that.
Oh, sorry, I know. But this actually is not a new idea. You mentioned California. The Probation Subsidy Act was back in 1968. They were kicking money. People think, Prop 47 and the and kicking money back, to the locals. This goes back, more than a generation. Ronald Reagan. I know that people are not the biggest fans of Ronald Reagan sometimes in this room, but Mark Levin accepted. But these are actually very consistent with a lot of conservative principles of how about we just move the money where it makes sense, and then and if you can move these dollars where we're spending them, and it costs a fortune in a correctional bed, but you can spend a lot less and get better outcomes, and and the services cost a lot. You know, I mean, this is a very the problem is it's actually really hard to do statutorily, and it's very hard to do in practice because systems aren't used to that kind of change.
So we think, and we can get in here, we think though that there are places to realign incentives at the county to state level, about the office to county level, the PO to office level, and the probation or parolee to PO. At each of those stages, there are opportunities to bring in incentives to the mix, and we know that there's a lot to learn from behavioral economics. We don't know what the answers are, but in the RFP that we released this morning, we have put an opening out there for incentives at all of these levels to be tested, and we hope we'll get some good ideas.
And I'll just say too, I think that in the academic community and a little bit among probation officers, there's this discussion about what is the goal of probation. So I think like even to talk about incentives, I mean, you have camps that are rehabilitative, you have camps that are law enforcement minded. So from a law enforcement perspective, I mean, so I think up here, we're only giving you one side of probation. But there are people who see themselves much as, you know, a law enforcement perspective. Public safety is the #1 goal. When I asked this question with the Robina Institute, what are the goals of probation? I would get a bunch of different answers from judges, probation officers, attorneys, and that matters. We have to revisit what our goals are, because then that matters what the conditions are that you place, that matters what the length of probation is. So I don't think there's agreement on what exactly the goal of probation is. So I would be cautious to moving to incentivizing or developing incentives when our goals are sort of all over the place in different jurisdictions.
Denise, who's got the mic?
I have a question. I wondered if there was anyone up there that has any insight, or if there were studies about particularly supervision with people with disabilities, particularly mental illness or traumatic brain injuries, and if there are any areas that people could point to that might help us figure some of that, how to do that better.
I'll just add real quickly, Jennifer Scheme at the University of California does a lot of work on mental probationers that have severe and persistent mental illnesses. So that's one person I would check out.
I wish I could tell you that we have the answer, but we don't. Because the systems are still very fragmented. We have tried to sort of bring together things. So let's say if somebody, I think in New York City now we have like sort of justice-minded ACT teams, for example. I still do not feel them in my world of, you know, criminal justice, of probation. What we have done is we're lucky enough to be part of the Mayor's Task Force on Mental Health and Criminal Justice. So now we have a behavioral health unit. So we have clinical advisors in each of our offices, who are working with our probation officers to both identify issues that may not be so apparent, and also to help people with serious and persistent mental illness to navigate, the various systems and try to coordinate with providers. But we have not worked that out. Okay, if that's for people, that's in the status quo. But we really have to think about whether probation is anything of help of any kind for someone with mental illness to be involved in the system.
Hi, I'm Joanna Weiss from the Fines and Fees Justice Center. My question is for the Commissioner. It was incredibly exciting and inspiring to hear about all the progress that's happening in New York City around supervision. But given that we are trying to make work happen at this conference, my question to you is, how do we get rid of the $30 per month DWI probation fee? And by the way, there's a conversation with City Council on Thursday, and can we tell City Council that we have your support to get rid of that fee?
Don't put me on the spot or anything like that. Look, that is a complicated process, okay? I unfortunately cannot take a position like that in public. But let's just say I hope you're successful, okay?
Hi, Steve Finkelstein. Dr. Rule mentioned that she's going to be doing some research on the disparities of the fees among the various jurisdictions. I'm more concerned about the disparities between the revocation process itself. For instance, here in New York State, for probation, the probation officer has to go before a criminal court judge and get a warrant, whereas under parole, he merely has to go to his supervisor, the senior parole officer, and they can lock someone up just based on that. Is there any research, or will there be any research on these various disparities and recommendations? As, you know, like perhaps should there be legislation that in the parole system in New York, you have to go before a judge for a technical violation before you can rearrest and reincarcerate someone, either Jake or Dr. Rule.
Well, I mean, part of the issue is that the two things are very different from a legal perspective. So, no, I know, but parole, the issue with parole, and there's, I'm sure, reforms to be done there in terms of what processes you can use for revocations, but because the status of the person, their sentence is still incarceration, they are not required by law to go in front of a judge, and I don't know that there would be. I don't know what the options would be to add that to a process of revocation. I don't know enough about the law to know that.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that varies, again, state by state practices. So in some probation departments, they can revoke, well, nobody can revoke for the full sentence without going before a judge. But some can, you know, put people in jail for 30 days max. A probation officer has that right. Some can do weekends, some don't have any authority other than a couple of days. So that probation is one that definitely varies. And same with parole, varies state by state. In some states, you have to go through an administrative board or the parole board. So I think that, to your point, there needs to be a lot more research. Again, if we're talking about feeders into incarceration, we have to understand this process and the variations state by state.
Yeah.
In response, I didn't have an original idea, and then I heard him talking. It's like, actually, it reminds me of something. Louisiana passed a law that capped first-time technical revocations of probation, that's a mouthful, at 90 days. Then about a year or two, a couple years later, we funded a small evaluation of it to see what impact, if any, did it have. It shortened, obviously, revocation terms. That was the whole intent. It reduced new crime revocations, which is kind of interesting. We didn't sort of expect that. Didn't have much of an impact on the technical revocations. In fact, those went up a little bit. But the whole point was there was no increase in crime revocations, so it didn't appear to be that it risked public safety in any way. And overall, it cleared a whole lot of prison beds, so it saved the state about $17 million a year. So good outcome. Took that information, gave it to an in-state advocacy group. They then went and helped expand the law to all subsequent technical revocations. And then a bunch of other states in more recent years have put those are called revocation caps for shorthand. And some states are putting them as short as 3, 5, 7 days for first, second, and third time technical revocations.
Hi, Christine Karamaki. So I'm going to cheat because I have two quick questions. The first is, I'm wondering what percentage of probation parole officers are people with convictions, and what's kind of being done, if anything, to make sure that, I guess, the people who are supervising have lived experiences and are people who have been impacted. And then my second question is, I thank you so much for all your amazing knowledge and expertise, but I'm still kind of feeling like I don't really have something to take home of that's practical in terms of how we can make the system successful. So I'm wondering if each of you maybe could just give one practical implementation that can actually be done within the probation parole system that can kind of make it better and more successful.
What organization are you in?
I'm with Californians for Safety and Justice. I'm a researcher. Thank you. Criminal justice reform.
Let me answer your first question, I guess. In New York, and this varies across the country, so I can only tell you about New York City. Having a criminal conviction does not disqualify someone from being a probation officer. What happens is that our general counsel flags this, and we have a meeting. We have further meetings with the person who's applying for the job, and most of the time we hire the person. So. It's not unheard of for us to hire people, but it's very important to have a mix both in the probation department and also working with community folks who have been impacted by the system, because they have the broadest reach and the longest lasting connections to people, and so that's a really important component of our practice.
I didn't hear too much what organization, that matters a lot.
Wait, what?
What organization is it? What kind of organization?
Well, I was asking for me, but Californians for Safety and Justice.
Yeah, what? Okay.
It's, to be honest, I think we just need to reduce the number of people on probation. I think that, there's all this work that will look at how to reform probation and how to make it better, but there's a lot of people that are on probation that don't need to be on probation. Just that, you were talking about, Commissioner, about low-risk individuals. There's some people who got arrested, spent one night in jail. That was all they needed to not ever, commit crimes again. So we have to be comfortable with hands off on low-risk, medium-risk individuals. And even parole, reducing the number of people on parole. Like Ohio has a post-release conviction. So you can serve your whole sentence in prison, whole sentence, you've served it all, and come out on this post-release conviction. And that's different than parole. It's not like you're getting out early or still have time left. They've tacked time on, and it was sort of there to help, help people transition, and we started all these policies to help people and help get them back into the community, but then they turn punitive, and they can yank people back into prison. So I would say the simple solution is to reduce our numbers. It doesn't make the public any safer.
And there's different levels of this. So at the state level, it is working with your state policymakers to change some of these kinds of laws and policies that Jake has been talking about. And as he mentioned this morning, he and we and Robina will be developing a model policy framework, which will give guidance, concrete guidance to states that want to take this on. And then at the agency level, there are lots of things that can be done. So if low risk and less is part of the answer, it means we haven't even talked once about risk assessment. Start with an assessment on the front end to make sure that we're focusing resources and interventions on the highest risk population, because that's where the interventions will be most impactful, and pay less attention to the lower risk people, because we do know from the research that can actually have a negative impact.
But I just kind of want to follow up on what can be done on the local level without legislation. Just changing the rules of how, again, we're supervising on a local level. I know there are some areas that have just stopped drug testing for marijuana because the rate was so high of revocating individuals for testing dirty for marijuana, and it had become the norm. And even in some states where marijuana is legal, it's still illegal to use it while you're on probation. It was just contradicting. So doing things like that can actually plummet the level amount of people on probation that are getting revocated, especially in those communities of Black and brown color.
I think it's a great question. It's sort of a challenge for me because it sort of sparks a million ideas, and it also depends on where you're coming from. But part of the idea with the Sharp Broken report we just released with the Arnold Foundation was to spark it wasn't aimed at solving a whole bunch of problems, it was aimed at surfacing a whole bunch of questions and issues. So one thing you could do, if any of those charts speak to you, and I know data's not everyone's best friend, but if they speak to you, one thing you can do is go back to your home state and say, like, I want to reproduce those for my home state or my home county or my home city, and see, like, do those raise a problem statement or raise a bunch of questions? Because you simply surface those and say, interesting, has it grown or has it fallen for my home jurisdiction? Are revocations driving our correctional populations or are they not? Do we have disproportion or do we not? You just simply raise the question and then let people wrestle with that. That's a totally safe thing. Then you turn to things like policies, which is where a lot of people's heart's at. right? You can start asking things about revocation caps. Do we even have them in our state? Where are they? How do they compare with what the research indicate they should be? You can look at things like earned compliance credit. You know, when we did this study on Missouri's, we also did a whole map. We put every state, here's what their policy is. Do they have is the default to award the credit, or is the default not to award it? That matters a lot in whether or not it gets awarded. And there's a whole bunch of things. We haven't even talked about things that are fundamental here, like administrative or banked caseloads. Right? I mean, I don't know if people, this is getting in the weeds of this stuff, but a lot of people on supervision don't get supervised. Worth talking about at some point, right? Why are those people on supervision? Should they be? You could go on and on about this. Maybe this is one thing we should do. It should be a fact sheet. 10 things you should do or ask or go home and talk to your local elected official about. So thanks for giving me that idea.
Okay, so Denise O'Donnell, I'm with NYU, Miss Program now. I have a comment, and then I want to ask my question. And the comment is that at one point, I know in New York State, parole started making it more difficult to revoke parole, and did require things like writing up the report, like having a supervisor conference, like having the supervisor meet with the individual who is being supervised. And I don't know how much you're doing that, but some of those small due process kinds of, or accountability provisions had a pretty amazing effect. So that's just one comment. But my question really goes back to where we started out with Deanna's comment about what we do with people who do relapse, who have a substance use disorder. And I didn't quite follow, Commissioner, where you are in the process with people who continually get these violations because of an addiction problem. I don't know how far we've come to a harm reduction type approach, and also medication-assisted treatment, and whether that makes a difference, and we're really responding to the public health aspect of the addiction. So I wonder if you and the professor could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, we are, okay, what I'm trying to convey and have as policy for our department, not always followed, okay? So, having said that, when somebody has an addiction problem or it's certainly a mental health issue, we should not be filing violations of probation for the behavior that actually is contributing and or cause the person to be on probation in the first place, right? Do we see those violations? We do. But what we've done then is to put a bunch of layers of approval before one of those can get filed. So that if you're going to file a technical violation, you have to go 2 supervision levels up before you're allowed to file it. So that there's at least 2 sets of supervisors observing that, who can then come back and say, what about this? Have you engaged the clinical advisor in this? Can we go a different route? So we are definitely trying to, everybody's been trained in motivational interviewing and stages of change, so harm reduction is embedded in a lot of what we're doing and a lot of the decision making we're doing. So we are, my best answer is that we're trying to go in that direction, basically.
And again, probably sounding like a broken record, but I would say kick those people out of probation and not have probation supervise them, because if it's a substance abuse issue, if they're doing everything else that they're supposed to be doing, but it's purely a substance abuse issue, probation is not set up to provide rehabilitation. Probation is not set up in a social work framework. A lot of them, maybe aspire to be social workers, or but many of them get criminal justice degrees, many of them law enforcement background. So automatically, they're just not set up to be rehabilitation focused. So I would, just kick them out of probation and have another entity provide the services so that they can truly get the treatment that they need. And then one thing I'll add is, like in Minnesota, in many rural counties, there's just not a lot of options. So judges will revoke people for substance abuse issues and send them to prison because there's not community service providers in those rural areas. So we have to, if we can kick those people out of probation, save money, maybe we can then, provide more treatment centers in the community.
For some people, though, is it a probation obligation or opportunity to connect people, not to provide the treatment, but to connect them to treatment, as well as jobs, housing, the other supports? Again, not for everyone and not as a condition, but for those who truly need it?
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely, that's part of our case management is part of what we do. But going back to what Ebony said, definitely if it's, we totally agree, and that's what the reforms we did in the juvenile justice system were really geared towards that, because the juvenile justice system here had become essentially a surrogate social service providing system, and it's not, and it shouldn't be, and those kids should not be in the system if what they have is major social service needs. We're trying to apply the same thing. I wish we could apply as much of it in the adult system, because those, especially a low-risk individual whose issue is a substance abuse problem, that's not a public safety concern, right? And so, so I wish they were not on probation. But if they are, then we're trying to work with them in the way that I was indicating.
So I think one of the things to be very important is that the intersects of where interventions can happen, because again, getting to probation, the drug addiction was the issue, but it was not discovered because the charge and the act to get the drug was criminalized. So the actual understanding that substance abuse was needed was only once you were sentenced to probation and provided a dirty urine screen. Had on the front end of the arrest it been discovered, they never give a drug test on the front end. I always say you don't test dirty, you just actually are arrested for the crime that you did. But no one's discovering, or in my community, when we look at drug court, individuals of black and brown color are not admitted into drug court. They are not getting that same assessment on the front end of the system to go into an alternative to incarceration program. So there again, being criminalized for the crime to get the substance, and only the substance abuse issue being discovered once you're on probation and providing a dirty urine screen. Again, so how do you get the treatment when you're already on probation for the crime? That's directly related to the substance abuse is another thing we have to think of it, of how do we do those interventions at those certain stops in the criminal justice system.
I think we have 5 minutes left. We're going to do 1 or maybe 2 quick questions, final thoughts. Does somebody have the mic right now? Yes. There we go.
Hi, my name is Lawrence Bartley of the Marshall Project. My question is about parole revocation. As we know, it's a struggle for many men and women on parole to earn a living. Now, for instance, there are many men and women who look for opportunities to earn a living. It might be attending speaking engagements, or it might be attending funding events where they can earn honorariums and therefore have the opportunity to have gainful employment. However, there's a restriction, particularly in New York City, where men and women can't leave their boroughs. So in order to leave their boroughs to attend some of these events, they have to contact their parole officers. And because of the many people on parole, I believe in New York State is 38,000 people on parole. Each parole officer has a vast caseload, so therefore that parole officer can't answer the phone to be in contact with that individual. And if that individual misses out on that particular engagement, that individual loses the opportunity to earn funds. So I'm asking, are there anything coming up in the future, like on a local policy level, in order to change that, so those men and women don't get technical violations and go back to prison when they're just simply trying to earn a living? And something outside of legislation, because getting the populace of the Assembly and the Senate to agree on one thing, particularly criminal justice, is almost impossible. So,
I don't know if there's any New York answer to that.
No, I was just going to say I completely agree. And often a condition of parole and probation is that people must be employed, but then they have criminal records that make it difficult. But I think one thing that would help, maybe not on a policy or legislative level, is reducing caseloads of officers so that they can respond to the needs of their case. Because oftentimes probation officers and parole officers have 300 people on their caseload. They don't get, they can't get to them. So that might be one way to remedy the situation. Or, some probation departments and parole departments will have like an administrative where you can call in and get those, they can make those executive kind of decisions right then and there. but I don't know.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know enough about parole to comment.
I think the larger point here, though, is that there is discussion that conditions should be small, they should be few in number, they should be relevant to the specific needs and risks of the person, and they should be research-based. They should have some tie to reducing recidivism, and I think all of that is up in question now, including some of the conditions that you discussed. And so one of the things we're hoping to spur with the request for proposals that went out today from our foundation is research into exactly these kinds of issues and others. So we hope actually to generate some new testing of ideas, some new rigorous research, and really try and, this has been an invisible issue, and we're hoping to be able to ground some new ideas and gain some new evidence and get some new recommendations for the field so that we can do things a little better. Do you have?
One thing, building on what Amy said, which we did a call for members of the media this morning to talk about the report we released, and at one point just asked her, do you have anything to add on a part about how agencies should be driving this forward, supervision agencies? And the first thing she said was conditions. The first thing she went to, and I think that the point was we sort of stamped these things on, right? It's a regimented list, and to me, what's really powerful about that was this is a person who runs a major supervision agency in a very large county in this country, and so this is not coming from outside the system. This is the system leadership saying we shouldn't have this regimented list. It should be way pared down.
We've got 1 minute. Do we have any closing thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, I mean, I think going to conditions is another frontier. Definitely, we have like 30 in New York City, so that's on my list. That's on the bucket list. And then also, being able to, I think the application of the evidence-based practices of the whole idea of risk assessments and caseloads and so on and so forth is very important, but I think there's still a larger issue because probation has been ignored for so long, for example, community corrections, and also a flip side of the argument we're all making here in terms of reducing the number of people on probation is that then the impetus is, okay, so reduce your staff, you end up with the same caseloads, but we know that supervising people who are of higher risk takes longer and more intensity and so on and so forth, right? And so I think sort of breaking that down enough to have a meaningful path to a system that makes sense is going to be both a challenge and an important process that we have to engage in.
I just want to say one of the things we have to make sure of is that as we're changing those policies locally, that people with direct experience are sitting at the table and having a voice in those decisions and how it's played out. And especially paying attention to certain communities that have been marginalized and over-policed, of how that new policy is going to play out in those communities is going to be very important as well.
And I'll just say that we need to consult the research and consult the evidence. So yes, this is a new issue in terms of policy and how we're beginning to think about it, but academic researchers have been looking at this issue for a long time in terms of what works, what can reduce recidivism. I come from another life before I was at the University of Cincinnati working in the field, and it wasn't until I was at Cincinnati now writing for academic journals that I realized all this research out here. Here I think I have these bright ideas and they're actually already researched. So I think that we do need to consult the research a little bit more because we know that there are evidence-based practices that do work.
So my thought here is that the research and state experience over the past decade would indicate that we can have higher success rates, we could have lower recidivism, and we can have less incarceration if we focus on the system. But it's going to take real work, and it's going to take more research. It's going to take more commitment from people both outside and inside the system. And I really hope folks in this room and folks attending this conference will join us in pushing for this.
We have one last question.
Yes.
How you doing? I'm Devon Simmons. I'm a recent John Jay grad, and I noticed that the conversation that's been going on today, no one has talked about the psychological strain of being on parole or probation. So I wish someone could speak to that, because if probation or parole is designed to build self-efficacy, then why is it so many people on it?
That's exactly my point, is that we need to get people off of probation and parole, because it actually, for a lot of people, does a lot more damage. It's hard for people. When people are choosing prison over probation, that's a problem. And when I interviewed people all the time, even in prison, I interviewed people who had probation revocations, and many of those individuals self-revoked. And they didn't self-revoke for 1 year, 6 months. They self-revoked it for 5 years. They've self-revoked it for their full sentence. They'd rather sit in prison than be on probation. And so that's absolutely why I said we need to limit the number of people on it, because it does people more damage.
So really quick, thank you, Devon, for that, because I think individuals don't understand even how the parole or probation officer shows up at my house has the impact on my children. How you show up on my job sometimes instead of meeting me at lunchtime and not allowing me the boundaries of being human and being respected, that you're calling all the rules and the shots. That's why I keep stating that the importance of having directly impacted individuals at the table, because as researchers, commissioners, and actually supervisors, of course I'm going to report to you what I'm supposed to report to you, but the end user can share with you what the actual experience is.
So, totally agree. Sometimes I wish I could call my department the Department of Humanity. No, I'm serious, because that's what we can never forget, the humanity of everyone we serve in this business, and we too often do. And so to just recognize that's part of the way we're trying to change the culture in our Department of Probation, is that you cannot ever forget that the person in front of you is a human being, and act accordingly. No matter what you have to do, whether law enforcement, whatever it is, that person is a human being, and you have to attend to their emotions.
That's where we're going, and changing the culture is a major part of this piece, and there are very few places who've taken on. You've done so successfully, but we have a lot to learn. We have a lot of, I think, new momentum here, and we hope you'll all join us in helping finding a way from where you sit to make a difference and move this field along. Thank you.